So thank you, Joe, for the introduction, and also thank you for Joe and Murray organizing and inviting me for this wonderful conference. And thank you, Ricardo, for the organization. But as Joe told you, I lived 2 years in Lugano, a psychotherapist, and actually I attended from 1983 to 1988, the Eranos conference. So I also, witnessed, so to say, the death of the Eranos conference. It was a very, very shocking happening at that time. So I'd like to start with my presentation. I noticed most presenters have papers to read, but as I have to represent the postmodern style, I use iPad for my presentation. In the introduction of the first volume, Jung's Red Book for Time, Searching for Soul in Postmodern Situations, Murray Stein wrote about the plan proposed by Thomas Arzt of making a collection of papers on Jung's Red Book. You mentioned, Murray mentioned it yesterday. And he wrote, I was not certain it was a good idea or even possible. Hasn't been enough written about the Red Book already? That was a question. And we're organizing here another one, and I heard this would be the 5th volume of this series. But the world situation is changing since then. We are facing again the task how to cope with the war and even possible world war. As we know, the birth of Red Book is keenly connected with a crisis of the world and the onset of First World War. Following one crisis after another, beginning with COVID-19 pandemic, our impression of the Red Book is probably changing as well. Initially, I wanted to add postmodern aspects of Red Book to my previous papers, as I had more and more such an impression of this book. But facing the new world situation, I feel very much compelled to add another aspect to my presentation. This has to do with the distinction and connection between collective and personal dimension of crisis, or in my expression, between big story and small stories. And it is interesting to follow the change of Jung's attitude during his confrontation with the unconscious from this point of view. First, mythological images and madness with a question mark. In the first reading of Jung's Red Book, one can be totally impressed by full of mythological and archaic images. In his famous beginning visions, the whole Europe was flooded. I saw a terrible flood that covered all the northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. It reached from England up to Russia, and from the coast of the North Sea right up to the Alps. I saw yellow waves swimming rubble, and the death of countless thousands. This overwhelming vision reminds us of the Genesis flood narrative in Old Testament. Another examples are figures such as Elia, Salome, Philemon, who are ancient and historical figures. The image of serpent appears quite often. We had a nice discussion yesterday, quite often in Red Book. The serpent has highly symbolic meanings, not only in Christianity. In the Liber Secundus, the ancient Middle Eastern god Istubar played an important role, among other figures. These images can be regarded as spontaneous manifestation and documentation of archaic layers of psyche. Not only the text, but also pictures are very impressive and look like full of mythological images. I think this image appeared already third time or fourth time. We probably like it very much. There are also many pictures of mandala. Another possibility to understand Jung's Red Book is to relate it to the pathology. Paul Bishop, who cannot come unluckily, mentioned in his paper that a translator of Jung's work, Richard Hall, was very much impressed by the Red Book Aniela Jaffa led him to see. Hall described it as full of real mad drawings with commentaries in monkish script. Madness is another indication to Jung's Red Book. But these two obvious understandings do not seem to grasp the true nature of the Red Book. Even these two views are misunderstanding. In my point of view, these misunderstandings, including Jung's own, happen because the state of consciousness or psychic structure is not taken into serious consideration. It is necessary for psychology to distinguish the level of content from that of form or structure. Gigerich uses a differentiation between the semantic and syntactic. Even images which look like mythological and archaic as content do not belong to the pre-modern mode of psychic structure, but to the modern psychological structure. We need probably more detailed explanation, but I try to show the difference of structure here quickly. The characteristic of pre-modern mode of being is that the community and its people are contained and embedded in the nature and the mythological world. This means also that there is no world outside of its own mythological world. To explain this using an example, I'd like to refer to Jung's experience when he visited the Elgoni in Uganda. They had a ritual in the morning when the sun came, went out of huts, spat into their hands, and hold them up to the sun. But they could not explain the meaning of this behavior, although this is highly meaningful for them. Jung's conclusion was that they actually knew only what they did, but not what they are doing. The meaning is implicitly contained in the action for the community. Only after the establishment of subject and viewpoint from outside, the necessity of meaning for the subject come into being. Jung represents here a typical modern subject who observes from outside and searches the meaning. Although the stance of Jung is very modern, I have to mention that his approach to the dream has a kind of pre-modern way. He says that the dream is its own interpretation, and the fantasy image has everything it needs, which corresponds to the pre-modern way of embeddedness in the mythological world. Following these dictums, he works with the assumption that there is nothing outside of dream. Another important aspect of pre-modern mode of being is that the crime and the illness was always the matter of community. This plays a decisive role for the question of madness and collective crisis in the Red Book. I would like to show you an example from medieval Germany. As a punishment, a thief was hanged on an oak tree, which was a sacred tree and represented the god Woden in the medieval Germany. This punishment was rather a ritual in community to offer the thief as a sacrifice for God to recover the order in community disturbed by a theft. So it didn't matter if the hung thief died or not. If a thief should not die after a day or so, he or she was set free. In the same way, if a person was possessed by a kind of spirit and talked and behaved strangely, this is a disturbance of the order of the community, which should be restored by a healing ritual organized by the whole community. But the rise of modern subject means that the established subject is liberated from the surrounding world. This leads, on one side, to have the nature or world as its object, which has led to science and technology. On the other side, the establishment of subject leads to a self-consciousness and a self-relation, which is a precondition for the modern psychotherapy. As to the structure of postmodern consciousness will come later when it appears in connection with the Red Book. Three, the beginning phase of crisis, collective crisis or madness. There seems to be an interesting change of the psychic structure throughout the time while Jung was confronting with his crisis. I'd like to follow this change in my presentation. In the beginning phase of crisis, Jung seemed to have difficulty to keep the structure of clear modern subject he had already established. Jung had a terrible vision of flat, which lasted 2 hours. I quote, "It confused me and made me ill. I was not able to interpret it. 2 weeks passed, then the vision returned, still more violent than before, and an inner voice spoke, 'Look at it, it is completely real, and it will come to pass. You can't doubt this.' I wrestled against for 2 hours with this vision, but it held me fast. It left me exhausted and confused, and I thought my mind had gone crazy." Here, Jung had difficulty to keep a modern consciousness. He was totally embedded in this vision and could not have any viewpoint outside of it to understand what was happening to him. This viewpoint outside of fantasy should distinguish reality from fantasy. In the state of embeddedness in the vision and of confusion of reality and fantasy, he was in a sense in the mode of pre-modern way of being. But unlike pre-modern world, he did not have connection to the community. Reading, for example, documents of Japanese medieval time around 12th century, we can notice that dreams were shared by the community and influenced the reality as effective as real actions and happenings. But Jung's vision was not shared by the community. He even was afraid of making it open to the public for many years after the crisis. Although his experience had a pre-modern quality, it was not shared by the community as its crisis and could not yield to any collective meaning, unluckily. It is, however, interesting to note that, as Sonu Shamnatasani pointed out in his introduction to the Red Book, in the years, I quote, in the years directly preceding the outbreak of war, apocalyptic imagery was widespread in European arts and literature, end of quote. So we can still notice the possibility of sharing with the community or the collective. As a soul moves slowly, yeah, I heard quite often from James Hillman this phrase. As a soul moves slowly, this can be done much later. This lack of sharing is why Jung was very much afraid of losing the modern consciousness and of going to madness. In the pre-modern way of being and sharing, there is only danger for community, but no personal madness. Only one who sticks to the modern consciousness is afraid of losing it. This is similar to occurrence of a kind of nightmare of being pursued in adolescence, where clear consciousness is about to be established. As I already showed in my previous paper, there was no real danger of onset of schizophrenia for Jung. The essential way of being in case of schizophrenia is a passive way of being seen, observed, and threatened. The overwhelming and tremendous other is destroying the subjectivity of ego or consciousness, very often in the mode of talking to ego, acoustic hallucination. Jung's clear vision shows that he keeps a solid observing consciousness, which is totally different from the passive and destroyed way of being in case of schizophrenia. 4. Outbreak of the First World War. On August 1st, the First World War broke out. I quote, in 1925, Jung recalled, I had a feeling that I was an overcompensated psychosis, and from this feeling, I was not released till August 1st, end of quotation. This was a turning point in his crisis. The outbreak of the war made it impossible to think that his crisis and terrible visions were anticipation of a crisis of world, and that they had nothing to do with his personal crisis and danger of psychosis. This was a differentiation of the personal level from the collective one. Although Jung understood his crisis as a collective one, he did not pursue this dimension directly. He could have worked a kind of mentor for Swiss government or for the world. In some countries, there have been and are still spiritual mentors for politicians, but he was rather relieved from this aspect. In this sense, the outbreak of war means liberation from both personal crisis of psychosis and collective crisis of war. Afterwards, Jung continued his personal involvement in a very unique way. I'd like to show the general psychology of victims of collective crisis, such as natural disaster and war, in which the differentiation of collective and personal level is crucial. For example, in psychological care of victims after the East Japan earthquake 2011, they started to tell their terrible stories about earthquake and tsunami and to have nightmares around 3 months after the earthquake. This is a phase of reflection which often leads to a natural recovery, which is called resilience. But some continue to feel depressed and ill and needed psychotherapy. If they continue to have nightmares and flashbacks, the recovery is difficult. We can say they stick to the collective level of experience. If they, however, in contrary, to start to talk about personal and small problems such as conflict in the family and working place, they can recover in the course of time. It is interesting because these small problems have nothing to do with a collective problem, but can contribute to the recovery of mental condition, which was disturbed by a collective problem. The differentiation between collective and personal dimension and the focus on the personal story is necessary for psychological care. According to my experience, this is valid for various fields of outreach work of psychotherapy. If we compare Jung's experience with the process after the earthquake, they have similarities. Both have a moment of differentiation between the collective and personal level, and of focus on personal dimension. But while the nightmare and flashback were the aftermath of the earthquake and other disasters, other natural disasters, it was an anticipation of disastrous war in case of Jung. Furthermore, Jung pursued his personal way in a very unique form, as we are going to explore. So, fifth, individuation, personal self-relation with individual images. Although Jung thought that his crisis was caused by the collective crisis of approaching war, he did not try to work on the collective level, using active imagination with figures who emerged in his visions and dreams. Jung tried to relate to images, these figures, who have symbolic and mythological connotations. This became a kind of prototype of process of his psychotherapy, which is called individuation. We can find a lot of similarity between the path in the Red Book and the description of process of individuation in his work depicted in the paper, The Relationship Between the Ego and the Unconscious, in the 7th volume of collected works. We can understand that his concepts of shadow, anima, animus, and self emerged from his own experience of inner figures. For example, the beginning chapters in the Liber Secundus about the red one and one of the lowly have to do with the confrontation with a shadow. The anima played a central role throughout the whole Red Book. In refer to distinction between substantial and formal level, and the differentiation between the collective and personal, we can find a very unique combination in Jung's path of individuation. As to the content, Jung's experience in his active imagination are collective and pre-modern. These figures, such as Philemon, Elias, Salome, and so on. But seen from formal and structural point of view, Jung's experience is personal and modern. typical for the structure of modern consciousness. His method of active imagination is a self-relation, which is a relationship and conversation with the image. This combination of archaic and collective content on one hand, and modern and personal and inner form on the other hand, is typical for analytical psychology. As his concept of collective unconscious shows, Jung tried to and hoped to reach the collective level through the personal. This can happen in a lucky case, as our analytical work confirms. Through this way of working with images, an archaic layer of the psyche can emerge. In my contribution to the conference on narratives in Rome last week, I tried to show this possibility. But I wonder if this trial can be really shared in community and reach the collective level. Sometimes we only use archaic and mythological images to cope with a very personal problem. Another problem of self-relation is that it can continue forever, although the self-relation always comes back to oneself. By reading Jung's Red Book, we have also the impression where the conversation with oneself is going. But while Jung was wondering where his path was going, he noticed that this is leading to the center. Jung drew sketches of geometric figures every day without knowing why. Only when I began to paint the mandala, I quote, only when I began to paint the mandala did I see that all the paths I took, all the steps I made, all led back to the one point, that is, to the center. The mandala became the expression of all paths. So his personal path has a center as goal. This is clearly shown by his famous dream of Liverpool and his interpretation. Now I come to postmodern aspects, arbitrariness and parallel dimensions. I try to show that the initial pre-modern way of being has changed to the self-relational mode of modern consciousness in the course of crisis and in the development of the Red Book. But Jung goes further. When I translated the Red Book from German into Japanese, I checked some unfamiliar names of gods and mythological figures on the internet and was compelled to study them. Then, by checking these figures on the internet, I found out that those figures in games and animation films come earlier than the original meaning of the figures on the internet. For example, if you search mime in Japanese, the top page looks like this. A figure in an animation film on Reiji Matsumoto is dominant, not a figure in Wagner's opera. This means that mythological or historical figures are used in a totally different context. This is a postmodern way of using archaic images. But did Jung also work in a similar manner? He uses more and more figures who do not belong to his culture and history. If one is not anymore contained and embedded in one's own tradition, there is a possibility of using and encountering images from a totally different culture and history. Anything goes. This can be a rich opening on one hand. We can notice this possibility if we work with sound play. In case of sound play, you can put any figures from any cultures. But this possibility can be an arbitrary movement from one figure to the other without reaching anywhere. So there may be no center in this psychological movement. I come to another postmodern feature of Jung working on the Red Book. In the beginning phase of his crisis, Jung was totally absorbed in the vision. But later, he could keep his psychotherapeutic practice and family life on one hand and worked with visions and active imagination in the evening on the other hand. I would say this is totally different from the initial situation. Jung compares the spirit of time with the spirit of depth. But does the spirit of depth belong to the depth in postmodern age? Yesterday, Thomas Fisher mentioned that Jung and his Red Book have a chance in the contemporary world of images. I can notice that our clients have less resistance to work with dream and images, as this work does not belong to the depth to be reached, overcoming the resistance, but to a parallel world. We are more and more used to change our character and mode of being according to the context. We can have several handle names or avatars can be made, and these can be male and female with various ages on various SNS platforms. There is no depth, but only parallel worlds or beings. Jung's Red Book somehow anticipated this way of postmodern being. Now it gets more serious. 7, return of the dead and the collective dimension. We have the impression, reading the Red Book, that the initial overwhelming power of image diminishes in the course of time, and the relationship with image becomes more and more the self-relationship or modern consciousness. Furthermore, the arbitrariness of images and the parallel mode of being suggest even postmodern way of consciousness. But this was not the end of Jung's experience of his crisis. As in the novels of a famous Japanese writer, Haruki Murakami, the postmodern way of being can make an extraordinary encounter possible. In this case, encounter with the dead. Jung felt compelled to continue to write Black Book in 1915 after a year of break, which led to the part called Scrutinies, Prüfungen, in the published Red Book. Here again, Jung was faced with a collective task of the time, redemption of the dead, in a very pre-modern and also postmodern way. There were several synchronistic happenings in Jung's house at the beginning of 1916. Then, I quote what happened afterwards from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I show the text on on the PowerPoint. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, the front door bell began to ring, ringing frantically. Everyone immediately looked to see who was there, but there was no one inside. I was sitting near the doorbell and not heard it, but saw it moving. We all simply stared at one another. The atmosphere was thick, believe me. Then I knew something had to happen. The whole house was as if there was a crowd present, crammed full of spirits. They were packed deep right up to the door, and the air was so thick it was scarcely possible to breathe. As for myself, I was all aquiver with a question. For God's sake, what in the world is this? Then they cried out in chorus, we have come back from Jerusalem, where we found not what we thought. That is the beginning of the Septem ceremonies. Then it began to flow out of me, and in the course of 3 evenings, the thing was written. As soon as I took up the pen, the whole ghastly assemblage evaporated. The room quieted and the atmosphere cleared. The haunting was over. End of quotation. As whole Jung's family was also involved with these extraordinary happenings. This was not only limited to Jung's own experience. This is not limited in Jung's inner world and goes beyond the structure of modern consciousness. The traditional religion and teaching seemed to be useless as the dead came back from Jerusalem, which is a sacred center for various religions. The dead can only be redeemed by a new teaching. The sermon begins with nothingness, which suggests that the idea of center is not valid anymore. As the soul moves slowly, the redemption needs often many years, sometimes generations. It is our task in our time to understand Philemon's sermons or to find a new teaching to redeem the dead, which would mean at the same time our own personal healing. Thank you for your attention.